Hello and welcome to the next session where we're going to be talking about improving the evidence base for consumer policy making. Just to tell you that if you have missed any of the sessions, you can actually see them on the OECD website. I think there were one or two issues with the streaming yesterday, so you might have missed little parts of it. But if you want to go back on something you weren't able to watch at the time. So it is, they're all available there, and the ones today will be available too. Also, in terms of networking, you probably have seen on the platform that there is a networking function. So if you want to get in touch with any other participants or panelists at the conference, you can do through the networking function. And also don't forget, please send us your questions for this session. We do want to hear from you, and we will get to those questions at the end. So if you think of any question at any time, just put it in the Q&A, and we will do our very best to answer it at the end. So as I said, we're talking about how to improve the evidence base for consumer policy making. It's really tough to assess things like consumer satisfaction or trust or level of engagement, or whether markets are really working for consumers. And all this information is really, really important, and the data that goes with it to improve policy making. Without it, policymakers are just working in the dark, if you like. So we really want to talk today about how we can improve that evidence base. So let me introduce the panelists who are going to help us do that. We have from the European Commission, Dionisie, who is head of the Economic Analysis and Evaluation Unit of DG Justice and Consumers. So Dan is doing a lot of work researching consumer behaviours, which is going to feed into consumer and justice policies of the Commission. So welcome to you. From Korea, we have Dr. Sujin Oh, who is head researcher at the Korea Consumer Agency. And I know that your recent projects include the development of the 2020 Consumer Markets Evaluation Indicator in Korea. So good to see you. We have Professor Dr. Justus Haucap, who is the founding director of the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics. And you recently co-authored a paper analysing the impacts of consumer protection laws in the EU on consumer trust and cross-border purchases. Hello to you. We have Matt Jones with us, who is the project specialist at Consumers International. He co-manages the development of the Consumers International Global Consumer Protection Index. Hi, Matt. Nice that you can join us. And finally, our moderator, who we met earlier in the week, Andrew Hadley, Assistant Director of the Policy and International at the UK Competition and Markets Authority. Andrew, I'll hand it over to you, and I'll join you again for the Q&A at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy, and a very warm welcome to all of our distinguished panelists, and also welcome back to our audience. We're going to talk, as Kathy said, about improving the evidence base for consumer policy decision making, which has long been a core part of the OECD consumer policies work. In particular, the Consumer Policy Toolkit that the OECD developed in 2010 is a really key document, and I very much encourage you to have a look at that if it's not something that you're familiar with. That gives advice to consumer agencies and indeed to broader policymakers on how to empirically assess where markets may not be delivering the best value for consumers using a number of different tools, so complaints data, consumer surveys, and also data on injuries and recalls of dangerous products, among others. Since then, the committee's continued to increase the output on its empirical work, its research work, and focused on the improvement of the measurement of consumer outcomes through different surveys, different behavioural experiments, some of which we've heard a bit more about in other sessions. In particular, at the moment, we're looking at a project to measure both financial and non-financial consumer detriment in e-commerce using a consumer survey in a dozen OECD countries, and we're hoping to get some early results from that later this year. That's very much building on the policy toolkit that I talked about, but based on that work and any new results coming from the survey, we'll develop a methodological guide for measuring the impacts of consumer agency activities. So today's panel session is very relevant for the OECD, and I hope for many of you as well. And this discussion and indeed future discussions will help the committee think further about what we should focus on in terms of our research agenda and which stakeholders we should prioritise and which issues we should focus on in terms of those. Before we move into the 3 topics that we're going to cover today, just to encourage the audience, please do share your thoughts and particularly your questions in the right-hand panel of the screen. As Kathy said, we're very much interested to hear from you. We'll do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can at the end of the session, but those questions are also interesting, even if we don't get time to answer them all, because they do give a sense of what other issues the audience are interested in and what else we perhaps as both policymakers and enforcers need to be thinking about. So please do look forward to hearing from you. So our first topic is about measuring key indicators to assess whether markets are working for consumers and to inform policy decisions, and we'll spend a bit of time on that. So our first sort of question really is about measuring key indicators to assess market performance for consumers and to therefore assess and inform policy decision making. So more specifically, a consumer agency or a policymaker may decide to measure consumer satisfaction. That could be very subjective or more objective, could look at detriment, it could look at consumer engagement in markets, or it could look at trust. And there are a number of different tools that I've mentioned before, surveys, complaints data, but also kind of more experimental behavioural research to understand what the best actions might be. So I'll first turn to Dan to hear from the European Commission, hear about the European Commission's work in this area. And we know that the Commission's been conducting EU-wide market monitoring exercises, consumer market studies, and other behavioural studies for quite some time now. It would be really interesting to hear from you on what you think the key consumer indicators to measure are, which measurement tools can be used, and any sort of recent thoughts on what has been most recently effective for you, and to perhaps to hear an example of how those results and that research inform decision making. So over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, the Commission, the European Commission, has deployed in recent years quite a wide range of tools for gathering consumer evidence. So you mentioned the market monitoring. We have a large-scale survey for this. We also have a consumer condition survey. We carried out quite a number of in-depth market studies that themselves deployed a range of investigative tools. We have done behavioral testing as well as using other data sources, such as complaints data that you mentioned. But when you're asking about the key indicators that we're looking at, again, these are quite a number, and some of them you've mentioned already. I would also stress the knowledge of consumer rights. So we are looking at the extent to which consumers are aware and understand their rights. Also, we used to survey retailers on the same topics. Consumer trust vis-a-vis a number of actors in the marketplace. So not just trust in retailers to respect their rights, but also in authorities to protect their rights. Trust in product safety, for instance, as well as in redress mechanisms. We have also been measuring the exposure to unfair practices in the marketplace, in particular unfair commercial practices or unfair contract terms, other fraudulent practices that we know are present in the single market. So we are also measuring that exposure. In terms of the experience in the market, we're also looking at problems, complaints of the consumers in response to those problems, the outcome of those complaints, so their satisfaction with the complaint handling and with the redress obtained. In particular markets, we're also looking, for instance, at the ease of comparing offers, the comparability of the products in the market. And in specific service markets, we're also looking at the switching behavior and obstacles to switching as well. These are important. And increasingly, we are looking at sustainability issues, in particular, how much environmental considerations inform or influence consumer purchases. And I would not end this list without mentioning two important dimensions that we've studied quite in depth. Consumer detriment, you mentioned that you're also working on it at the OECD. So on this, we have actually developed quite an elaborate methodological study back in 2017, and also consumer vulnerability, which again is a cross-cutting, rather multi-dimensional aspect that we have investigated in depth through a landmark study that was published in 2016. In terms of examples of the policy uptake of this evidence, of course, we are producing all this evidence and analysis for policy purposes, not just for our simple curiosity. And these are very systematically informing policy initiatives. Maybe to give one example of a relatively recent initiative, the New Deal for Consumer was adopted in 2019. The provisions there on increasing the transparency in online platforms, for instance, to inform the consumer who the seller is, who the actual seller is, and also whether it's a trader or another individual, and whether consumer rights apply to the transaction, whether the platform is responsible for the delivery and return and handling of any problems, or the third party is responsible. So all this information is now required to be provided, and this was informed by a behavioral study on transparency in online platforms. There are also provisions on the ranking of offers in marketplaces, and these were also informed by studies on online personalization, comparison tools, and the same on transparency in online platforms. And of course, we could go into detail. But my last point would be to say that consumer evidence is, of course, for consumer policy, but not only. It also informs a broad range of other policies, sectoral policies that impact on consumers. So to this purpose, we even have developed a specialized tool for assessing impact on consumers that is targeted at other policies, not consumer policy, be it digital policies, energy, and so on. And consumer evidence influences these policies as well. And the best example that comes to mind is everything related to digital, and starting with the digital single market strategy, which was extensively informed by consumer evidence, but also specific legislative initiatives under that strategy. For instance, the geo-blocking regulation, which was based, the impact assessment was mostly informed by a study that we carried out on geo-blocking. So I don't want to take more time for this first leg of the discussion, but of course there are many possible examples. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Dan, and I can see why struggle to fit all of that into a shorter amount of time, a huge amount of work, and that example I think is an excellent one, that the new provisions in the New Deal. Yes, we are a little bit behind. Turning next to Sujin. So we know that the Korean Consumer Agency has developed certain tools to measure how different markets are working for consumers, as well as broader consumer conditions and empowerment. So it would be great to have an overview from you on the tools that you're using, some examples of recent results, and again, how those results have informed policy decision-making in Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. The Korea Consumer Agency produced consumer markets evaluation indicators since 2014, which assesses the level of major Korea markets performance in terms of consumer perspectives. The indicators monitor how Korea market works for consumer and provide evidence to inform policy making. The KCA also plans to produce 5th consumer markets evaluation indicators this year and publish the result next year. The consumer market evaluation indicators are composed of Korea Consumer Market Performance Index, which is called KCMPI, as a main indicator, and 4 supplementary indicators. The KCMPI continues the positive trend observed since 2014. The fourth KCMPI of 25 major goods market in 2020 is 80.3 points out of 100 points. The results show an increase of 1.7 points compared to the previous KCMPI of 20 major goods market in 2017. Based on the result, 5 markets classified into underperforming markets among all 26 goods markets. The indicators is a screening tool for detecting underperforming markets and indicating to policymakers the areas on which further analysis should focus. Once problem areas have been identified, in-depth market studies needed to gain a deeper understanding into the problem and possible solution. Based on the findings of the indicators, the KCA conducted in-depth market studies as a follow-up. A number of underperforming and problematic markets have already been analyzed in the light of previous findings, and the remedies are being implemented. The recent in-depth market study conducted for the companion animal product market, which ranks 4th lowest among the product markets of consumer market evaluation indicators in 2020. The market scores particularly low on the choice and trust. Based on the result, the improvement of labeling and advertisement of companion animal food has been suggested. Actually, in addition to consumer markets evaluation indicators, KCA produces other indicators, which are consumption life indicators and consumer empowerment index, to measure consumer conditions and consumer capacity for the purpose of getting better insight of all aspects of consumption environment surrounding consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's extremely interesting. I hadn't expected to hear about animal food labeling in the session, but that's a really interesting example. Thank you very much. And I hope that the work that the KCA have put into developing those indices can be of value to other agencies looking to look at the same kinds of problems. Turning next to Matthew, we understand that Consumers International have been trying to build not just an index for one country to compare markets, but a global consumer index, kind of perhaps looking to bring together some existing indicators. So it'd be really interesting to hear any insights you have on that, as well as any other projects that Consumers International have or will be running to look at measuring consumer outputs.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you to the OECD for the invitation to participate on this panel. So there are many ways that Consumers International, our network of consumer associations and advocates, are working to improve the evidence base that we could perhaps discuss later if we have a little time. But I'd like to specifically focus on our Global Consumer Protection and Empowerment Index for now. So for some context, so as we all know, consumer rights and consumer protection touch on all parts of the global economy, and our belief is that consumer advocacy needs to be a central part of the national, regional, and international policy conversation. So during the pandemic, we worked with our members to explore how we come out of this stronger as a movement. And working with our council and select members, we proposed a vision for 2030. And as you'd imagine, key themes emerged as a focus on making digital technologies a priority issue for consumer protection, and how consumer advocates can drive towards sustainable consumption to ensure a safe, fair, and sustainable marketplace. So the Global Consumer Protection and Empowerment Index aims to track our progress against this vision and raise the visibility of consumer advocacy. So if successful, it will allow for previously unexplored comparisons between regions and countries, and also offer a valuable advocacy tool for our members to improve the conditions at the national level too. So the index is currently in its pilot year, and we are building this in partnership with our membership and experts in consumer protection, empowerment, knowledge, and sustainability. We'd also like to hear anyone who's listening in on the call that is interested in working with us too. So the index is currently under development, and it's built using 5 thematic pillars covering empowerment, protection, knowledge, sustainability, and innovation and technology. The index will be built using a combination of publicly available data by country and also expert assessment data collected from surveys of Consumers International members. I won't get into the technical details, but perhaps I can highlight 3 areas of the consumer experience we have been having interesting discussions and that we are looking to measure. So number 1, we're exploring the digital revolution and the degree to which consumers and consumer advocates are central to the design and regulation of new technologies. We're exploring the extent to which countries have proactive governance to protect consumers in this space, and also whether innovations are taking place in the marketplace. So for example, the specific indicators that we're using to test this, an example, looks at the levels of participation in ISO standards around new technologies, as well as expert assessment data gathered from our members on their involvement with government strategy on new tech and innovation. Number 2, we are also working with experts to understand the importance of consumer knowledge. So it's interesting to note that experts have flagged that consumer knowledge is a critical piece of the puzzle, but warned against emphasizing its importance as one of the pillars. So in the currently rapidly developing digital landscape with IoT entering every home, for example, information transparency and awareness is necessary, but needs to be surrounded in the ecosystem of robust protection. So we're investigating measures to portray this balance accurately. And lastly, similar to what Dan mentioned, cross-cutting the whole index, we're also exploring how to measure vulnerability. So as we know, more consumers in a multitude of ways can be classed as vulnerable, whether it be from lack of access to redress or justice, threats from the environment, or socioeconomic problems. We're also looking to track vulnerability for a range of indicators focusing on their core vulnerabilities and systemic vulnerabilities. So this includes at the basic level, core vulnerabilities, we're looking at indicators around access to healthcare, food and finance, but at a more systemic level, we're looking whether countries are members of the International Ombudsman Institution, for example, or countries are adhering to the G20 OECD's high-level principles on financial consumer protection. Of course, we do recognise that indices are blunt tools and there will be gaps in knowledge and data considering the country coverage, but we hope that the index will provide an effective advocacy tool for discussion and exploration at a national and global level. Thanks, Andrew.
No, thanks very much, Matt, and really fascinating topic. And I would encourage people to get in touch and see what you're doing and contribute if you've got ideas, because there's lots of really interesting progress to be made. So moving on to the second topic. We're going to look a bit more at tools to measure the impacts of consumer agency and policy actions. This is obviously helpful in order to understand how we might, as agencies and as policymakers, make decisions about which interventions and which other actions might be needed. But in some cases, it may also be very valuable for consumer agencies to gather evidence about their effectiveness in order to make, for example, the case for additional or indeed to protect existing budgets from cuts. So it can be an extremely important tool for consumer bodies. So I'll turn next to Justus, and you recently co-authored a paper looking at the impacts of consumer protection laws in the European Union on consumer trust and cross-border purchases. So would be really interesting to hear about the approach you employed and any results, and then I guess any thoughts you had on how such methods could be used to assess other agency actions. Thank you.
Yeah, Andrew, thanks very much. This is a paper that I did with Anja Rösner and Ulrich Heimesoff that was published in the International Journal of Industrial Organization last year. And we looked in particular at the European Union's Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. We were interested how has it affected consumer trust, but also shopping behavior, both domestic and cross-border online shopping. And we used what is called a difference in difference methodology. And for those of you who are not econometricians or economists, we can utilize the fact here that the Unfair Commercial Practice Directive was implemented in different points in time in the European Union. So it was implemented between 2007 and 2010. And because we want to disentangle, let's say, with respect to online shopping, for example, there's a general trend that online shopping is increasing. So we wanted to know, is there really a difference that the UCPD has made? Because we see a general trend that it's increasing. And there we can say, well, in some countries was implemented in 2007, in some other countries was implemented in 2010, so we can somehow disentangle this. And in addition, we used data from Civic Consulting, a consulting firm that evaluated what was the level of consumer protection before the UCPD. And there we found actually that some countries already had quite a high level of consumer protection, so they didn't really change anything, while other countries had a very low level, so they had to change things. So there we could use the difference in the differences actually, and found using consumer survey data that was collected by Eurobarometer, that some of the data actually that Dan has reported on, we found that especially in the countries that had very low levels of consumer protection, it made a difference. It increased consumer trust, that is measured data based on 180,000 interviews actually that were conducted by Eurobarometer. And we also found that cross-border shopping actually increased, impacted by the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. So that while there is a general trend that it's increasing, we could see whenever a country implemented the UCPD that had a low level before, then we saw a significant increase. So thereby we were able to isolate, let's say, this effect. And of course, this is in the European Union, that is quite a handy tool, because we have this implementation at different states and otherwise a very roughly similar framework. So you can do this type of, let's say, what is considered the gold standard of policy evaluation, the difference in difference analysis. But I think that is maybe more general, applicable also to other countries where you have federal systems or European integrated or economic integrated areas, where you can see that different things happen at different points in time. Then you can see really whether a difference occurs. And for that, of course, it is quite important to regularly collect this type of data, that you can actually see what was the state before, what happened when something changed, in order to do this type of policy evaluation. That's why I think it's so important to collect both survey data, but also shopping behavior type of data. But also, I think what then already mean complaints data may be important to collect in the future to do this type of analysis.
Well, thank you very much. And as someone involved in the implementation of the UCPD in the UK, where we had a high standard of consumer protection, I'm disappointed to hear that it didn't have very much impact, but very pleased to hear about the methodology nonetheless. So turning next to Dan, we know that the European Commission has conducted a range of different evaluation and impact assessments. We've heard about some of them already, to determine the effect of policies and future decisions. In your view, which of those tools have been the most effective, and what approaches would you recommend to others? Thanks.
I think one good idea that I would certainly advocate is to evaluate the legislation in bigger packages. It's what we call in the Commission fitness checks, which means you are looking at the broader policy area, let's say consumer protection, and not only at a particular piece of legislation, but at, you know, the whole acquis, as we call it, or the most important regulations in that area. So why is this important? Because it helps also understand the interplay between the different pieces of legislation and their cumulative effects, and the fact that you know, there are interdependencies there, and their combined effect is not necessarily, let's say, the arithmetic sum of their individual effects when considered in separation. So this is I would say, a good experience, and we're trying to apply it more and more in our evaluation work. Of course, the fitness check of consumer law that was carried out in 2016, 2017. was a landmark, and actually was the first step towards the New Deal for consumers that followed. That one covered 6 consumer directives, the main pieces of legislation on consumer rights in the EU. Another example that I would mention of, let's say, effective tools, and building on what Justus was presenting earlier, is indeed econometric modeling in impact assessments in particular. The example that he gave actually on the UCPD is very good, because we have used something very similar in the impact assessment of for the New Deal for consumers when it comes to, for instance, introducing remedies for consumers who are victims of unfair commercial practices. Because before the New Deal, let's say there was the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. So there were, some practices that were declared as illegal, but if a consumer was exposed or was victim of such practices, there was no under EU law direct redress for that. So in some countries there was redress, but in others no, and that allowed us to compare, looking at indicators, for instance, like exposure to unfair commercial practices. And indeed, we found that where there are remedies for consumers, there was lower exposure, lower reporting by consumers of unfair commercial practices, in spite of the fact that, having a remedy is actually an incentive to report the practice. So that showed that really, there is such an effect. And the same, we did the same kind of analysis on sanctions applied to companies that infringe, let's say, the UCPD. So this informed the proposal to enhance the sanctions and also to ensure that there are remedies for consumers. Yeah, I don't know. The second part of your question was, I think, about judging the effectiveness of consumer agencies. But honestly, I think this is something best done at the country level. It's difficult to measure the effectiveness of consumer authorities, of consumer agencies from the EU level with the one-size-fits-all. We can look at the outcomes, but of course the starting points can be very different as well. We have, for instance, if you look at a measure like trust, do people trust their consumer authorities? That's a good indicator, but you have high trust societies, you have low trust societies, you have societies where there is traditionally low trust in government, or on the contrary, high trust in government, and this of course would influence. So there are issues of institutional setup, of administrative capacity, of resources, and so on. So I would say that from the EU perspective, it's most effective to look to measure the outcomes, and we have this vantage position of being able to compare the outcomes in different countries, and hence to say whether, for instance, differences in legislation or differences in institutional setup can explain the differences in outcome.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll move on to just briefly talking about the attempts of my own organisation, the Competition Markets Authority, to measure its own impacts, and I hope that will be of interest to people before we move on to the final topic. So we have a central target of delivering 10 times what we spend in direct benefits to consumers, and so we've been doing quite a lot of work in this area for several years now. We report on a yearly basis, but we look at a 3-year average, because obviously sometimes projects and cases take longer to complete. Overall, we tend to see quite a high rate of benefits. So for the 2019-20 period, it's more like a 15-to-1 ratio in terms of effectiveness. Our 2020-2021 figures will come out this summer. Generally speaking, our market studies work and our mergers tend to have a slightly higher estimated impact than our consumer enforcement outcomes. We generally seek to estimate benefits based around likely price reductions or avoided price increases caused by our interventions. And in a number of cases, we tend to have a starting point of about a 1% impact based on the size of the market. We then look in a lot of detail at whether there are particular factors in that market or particular factors in the intervention that might mean we have a different rate there. It's obviously easier to get to those outcomes where our work is focused on prices or on particular charges. So, for example, in our current work on care homes for the elderly, or earlier work on online hotel bookings, which I'll come back to earlier, where we're looking at charges or the disclosure of prices. It's much harder where the work is less directly related to price. So, for example, social media endorsements, which relates very much to the some of the discussions in the last session about disclosure of advertisements, or online gambling, which were more about unfair contract terms and restrictions on withdrawing winnings. It's generally very difficult to quantify the benefits of our broader compliance work, and where we publish guidance, for example. It's much easier to measure the impact of a particular intervention, a particular project enforcement case. And we do think that as a result, the final figures that we come up with dramatically kind of understate the broader impact of our work. So we only tend to put the figures together where we've got a lot of confidence. I think probably the one thing I would recommend the most, in the question that I posed to Dan a moment ago, would be that we make a lot of use of independent academic reviewers to provide quality assurance. And I think that's probably the single most important thing I would recommend. It's very easy for us to have a bias on our own work, or to think that it's more effective than it is. So to look externally for validation of that. Just to look briefly at one specific example on online hotel booking, where we secured commitments from 6 platforms to improve transparency to consumers. The approach we used was we looked at the affected turnover. So we looked at effectively the revenues of UK hotel companies, and this was roughly about 1 billion covered by, so 88% of that relevant market, and about 1 billion market per year. We looked at the actions that we took, and we didn't find any sort of particular reasons to move away from that kind of starting assumption around a 1% impact. We used the working assumption that the effects would be likely to continue for about 3 years. No particular reason to sort of deviate from our standard approach there. There were some minor sort of discounts to that figure, but taking that kind of 1% figure over 3 years, we thought that that roughly amounted to about £30 million worth of consumer benefits. We then added in a few other companies that weren't investigated but still signed up to the commitments, and that covered an additional 8% of the market. So we added that in, which ended up with a total figure of about 33 million. Now you can see from that that it involves a lot of very heroic assumptions, that kind of approach, and people may well question that approach, but it's provided a useful starting point for us. Anyway, apologies, we're now a little bit behind. We'll move on to the final topic, and I might just ask contributors to limit their comments to no more than 2 minutes, please. So thank you all very much for the contributions so far. You've got a very brief last chance, audience, to put in any questions that you want us to consider at the end of the session. I don't think we're seeing very many coming in, so please do put those questions in. But just before we get to that, I'd just like to ask about 2 things. So ongoing challenges to improving the evidence base. So sometimes consumers aren't aware of the detriment, and obviously that's difficult to pick up in surveys. But also, and we heard a bit about this on Tuesday, there's lots of opportunities provided by new tools and methods and data, for example, new technologies that might help address these challenges. So could we make better use of AI in collecting data about actual behaviour or detecting problems? So I'd just like to turn to each of you in turn to suggest perhaps one challenge and one opportunity that we can look at using these new tools. And Sujin, we'll start with you, please.
Thank you, Andrew. One key challenge to improving the evidence base for consumer policy I would like to mention is the lack of relevant data to capturing right effects of consumer policy. Definitely, consumer policy implementation is likely generate to consumer benefits and cost. However, these factors are difficult to measure in a sufficiently robust manner. The impact of intervention can be measured only a part of the overall impact. However, advances in technology have widened the range of available information and enable the standardization of information, which could be the baseline of evidence-based consumer policymaking. Using chatbot applying AI technology provides possibility to improve the data quality of consumer complaints in terms of collecting and classifying data in more structured way. Consumer complaints and redress data from KCA is valuable qualitative data for detecting consumer issues. However, it's difficult to use because of the low rate of standardization of the data. Also, using big data analysis for analyzing consumer issue from diverse sources of information enabled consumer agency or regulatory authority to prevent potential consumer damages and to proactively respond to consumer issues ex ante. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sujin. And Matt, we'll turn to you next on your key challenge and opportunity.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So across the whole of our membership, consumer associations are adopting new methods to gain a deeper understanding. I'd like to highlight a couple, but first I'd like to really quickly emphasize that it's critically important that we listen to consumers and we survey them or analyze data. We must understand what they want, not what we think they want. So lots of work is currently driven by what people want to see, not the consumer experience on the ground. So we recently conducted an assessment of labeling information and the recyclability of packaging for 11 popular products across 9 countries. We found that on average, a third of the packaging was not easily recyclable and labeling was consistently confused, misleading, or non-existent. But we also found that when you look at the global packaging pledges and commitments, many companies are hitting targets. Although it's clear the lived reality for consumers on the ground is very different. I think what's important is understanding the needs of consumers and how we improve their experience day to day. But in terms of the new tools or methodologies presenting opportunities to deal with consumer challenges, rather than just outline one, I'll provide a couple of examples highlighted from our membership. So our member in the US, Consumer Reports, highlighted a new app, the Dark Patterns Tip Line, that allows consumers to tip off other consumers when they notice or have been victim to dark patterns, creating an ecosystem of consumers to track and protect each other. The app aims to hold companies more accountable while collecting important evidence of manipulation techniques. In Spain, FACUA Consumer Action have been creating an online platform for those affected by widespread frauds and scams. So the platform is specifically created for those frauds that can affect a large number of consumers, such as the Volkswagen Dieselgate case, for example. So these platforms allow them to quickly keep a large number of consumers informed and facilitate judicial actions to protect consumers. Quickly, in terms of challenges, some members are also exploring but have not yet implemented at scale algorithms to detect consumer problems, but the issue does raise budget constraints and cautions about the risk and bias in such algorithms. So the consensus from some of our members is that algorithms and data are valuable and appealing, but should be used wisely. So it should be used to target the larger fundamental reforms rather than going issue by issue. So we know that there are children's products with safety problems, but rather than going after them one by one, consumer associations set their sights on dealing with a whole class of products and look at fundamental reforms, and data needs to be used in that way. So these are just a selection of the potential tools our members use to understand consumer behaviours, and we're continually working with them to ensure that they remain at the cutting edge of developments and behaviour understanding. Cheers, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Matt. Certainly relate to that point about recycling information that you made at the start. Often very difficult to know what to do. Justus, we'll turn to you next on one or more challenges and opportunities, but just to remind you about we're a little bit behind on time. Thanks.
Yeah, let me just mention two things. First of all, I think science is sort of a natural ally of consumer policy agencies in evaluating consumer policy. So I think it would be quite good to have open data for evaluation purposes, such as the Eurobarometer data that we have. But what is also quite important is not only to have survey data, but also data about consumer behavior, actually. And here, and this is the second challenge, I think we see an increasing asymmetry, let's say, between the marketing departments or the firms and enterprises on the one hand, and the public and science on the other hand, because big data, loyalty schemes and so on make it actually feasible that the firms have access to quite detailed, quite good data about consumer behavior. But my feeling is that sort of we as the scientists, but also consumer agencies, are falling behind somehow, with having less and less of these, or the asymmetry is increasing. Let's say. So I would think it would be quite good to have something like a consumer panel or something that actually studies consumer behavior over time, that can be used for evaluation purposes. Basically similar data that is currently used by marketing departments or marketing agencies of these firms. This is, I think, one of the biggest challenge at the moment, to close the gap again.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your brevity there. Thank you. Finally, before we move on to the questions, could I ask Dan for his challenge and/or opportunity? Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. I promise I'll keep it short. First, just to emphasize the final point that Justus made about authorities, public authorities, running behind the marketing departments of large companies in particular, when it comes to policy and enforcement. And indeed, there is this asymmetry, both in terms of data, the big data that is available to, for instance, to online platforms, and to which we don't have access. In consumer policy, we are not able, let's say, like in competition policy, to interrogate companies and to ask them to provide certain information for enforcement purposes. There is this increasingly, let's say, targeted personalization, segmentation of the market to the extent that extensive online personalization and profiling raises significant challenges to enforcement. For instance, when you have different ads being tailored to different profiles, it's very difficult to detect, let's say, misleading ads, just as an example. So we are having this challenge of in a way, running behind. This applies also to our collection of evidence. It takes time to collect the evidence, to analyze it, to translate it into policy, for the policy to be adopted and then implemented. And the markets and the practices in the markets are moving very fast. And occasionally we have situations like those triggered by the COVID crisis, where we really have to answer urgently in terms of policy. Just the example with the cancellation of travel during COVID, and the issue of refunds or vouchers and so on. So that's one challenge, and of course there are ways to go about it. It's we need to make our data collection nimbler. We would greatly benefit if we had a better access to only for policy purposes to the data held by private companies, but of course we haven't cracked this one yet. And using new tools like automated enforcement online. So this is increasingly done, actually, automated sweeps to find whether there is the information is the legally mandated information is provided to consumers online. Another challenge, and I will stop here, is the administrative data from the member states. So this is another important source of data that would very well complement the survey and behavioral evidence that we have. is administrative data. So actually hard data on what happens in the markets, consumer complaints and others, enforcement actions. These are, they raise a challenge of lack of harmonization. So when this data is not harmonized, it's not easy to analyze it in a meaningful way, but there as well, we are making efforts. So the traditional approach was to try to harmonize the data, which is very, I would say, work intensive and resource intensive. But with the new tools like artificial intelligence, there are maybe ways to still analyze the data in a speedy way in real time without the need to have it harmonized. So I will stop here. These are maybe some challenges and opportunities for the future.
Thanks very much, Dan. That's great. And we need to just move on now to make sure that we have time to have a quick look at the questions. So Kathy, perhaps you could let us know what our audience have been asking while we've been talking.
We have a question from Helena Lauren from Consumers International, and she asks, what are the top areas of global research the panelists feel we need to pursue in the next 5 years? So where do we think we need to research in the next 5 years? And also, what other cross-cutting evidence areas, with that could be public health, trade or finance, do you think are important to look at in consumer policy decision making? So, so those are the two things. Where going ahead for the next 5 years priorities.
Thanks very much, Kathy, and thanks for those questions. They're great. So I think what I'll do is I'll ask Matt in the first instance to reply to that first question on areas of research, and then see if anybody else wants to come in. And then I might ask Justus to look first at the cross-cutting areas, if that's okay. But interested to hear from others. So Matt, what should we be focusing on in terms of our research?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So 2 areas have highlighted for us it's important for consumer advocates and associations across basically every region, and it's consistently noted in connections that we have with our members as well. And number 1, how do we reach net zero with all consumers fairly? So all approaches to net zero require change, but research over time has to understand how to engage all consumers fairly in that change. And then number 2, how do we increase engagement in younger consumers with younger consumers? So we actually have a next generation leaders network of young consumer advocates with 25 of our members across 21 countries that look to engage young consumers, but more work needs to be done to understand how to connect the younger generation over the next 5 years.
Brilliant, thank you. Any perhaps time for one very quick additional research focus from one of the other panelists, if anyone wanted to jump in briefly? If not, we'll move on to the second question. So Justus, what other cross-cutting evidence areas should we be particularly thinking about here?
Well, as mentioned before, I think that to study really consumer behavior, it's quite important because it's not always only related to price, for example, but changes in behavior more generally. You mentioned that price is often quite important, but Matt also mentioned, for example, the example of labeling. And there may be consumer benefits that are more difficult to measure because they may be interested in things like sustainability, for example, and may change their behavior due to labeling. For example, that may not be reflected in consumer savings in terms of prices, for example, but certainly still provide consumer benefits because otherwise we assume they wouldn't change their behavior. So I think we think about these consumer benefits in that sense in a more broad way, and we can sort of evaluate that by surveys to some degree and sort of willingness to pay and so on. But in the end, I think behavior gives us a little bit more confidence whether consumers really want something or whether they just say that they want something, but may in the end not be so interested.
No, thank you, and I think that links to very strongly to Dan's point on the sort of use of administrative data in the market as well. So thank you very much. So I think we're running out of time really, so I think we will. I think we'll stop there. There's a lot more to discuss. Certainly, I've got some reactions, but not time to dwell on those. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists very much for their fantastic comments and input today. It's been really, really welcome and helpful. And thank you for the audience, and thank you to those listening. And I'll hand over now to Kathy to sum up. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And maybe we could have a look at Josh's illustration to have a look. Yes, I mean, and obviously the awareness, the measuring is just key to it. And we heard all about the key indicators, so important. And also this idea of measuring knowledge of consumer rights, very important element there. Matt pointed out that indices are blunt tools, but they are actually really important advocacy tools. And then still in the measuring element, we talk about measuring the impacts of policy actions. And of course, it was pointed out that you need to collect data regularly to be able to do it properly, but also very importantly, and I think that Josh has got this summarized, make use of academic and independent voices and studies. Don't just do it yourselves, which is also very important. We also heard how important it is to listen to consumers. Don't just assume. And great examples of the dark patterns tip line, which I think is also on Josh's drawing somewhere. I think I saw it a little bit earlier on. And we also heard about how technology, AI can help to standardize information and really help in the future. But obviously a lot more data needed, things like consumer behavior or maybe data from private companies. So as usual, it's complex, but there's an awful lot going on out there, and it was really interesting to hear things like the fitness checks at the EU, you know, that are really, really, we hope, making a difference in terms of the way that policy is formulated in the future. So thank you very much indeed to everybody. Thank you, Josh, again for your lovely illustration. We're going to take a short break now. We're coming back at 14:40 CET, where we're going to be talking about strengthening cross-border enforcement cooperation. So I hope you can join us then. So we'll see you in 15 minutes or so.